All right. So thanks a lot for the time today. Hopefully won't take up the entire 20 minutes that we have here. But I guess this is Andrew Connell. You got some contact information about me there on the slide. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about testing in the SharePoint framework, coming to you from absolutely cold Florida, where it's actually colder here than it is in Alaska. All right, so one of my passions with the SharePoint framework is trying to make things easier for us developers. And one of the things that I have a lot of frustration with the SharePoint framework is around testing, or at least I did it initially, and now I'm not so frustrated anymore. And I want to show you kind of how I did it and why I like it. So out of the box, the SharePoint framework Yeoman generator scaffolding is going to generate your project, and the project that you get is really going to be set up initially to work with Mocha and Chai, which Mocha is a test runner and test library that you can use to write unit tests. And Chai is an assertion library. Kind of goes hand in hand. You think Mocha and Chai is the tea and coffee. And anyway, so the way that this is how things were when SharePoint Framework originally shipped. And when it first came out, I want sympathy, Stephanie. The way that things originally shipped, we were using these tools primarily for testing. Internally in Microsoft, they actually switched over and they use a different tool, the one that I'm going to show you how to use in just a few minutes. Now, one of the ways that they're all set up to do all of their testing is that whenever you go run your tests, you end up running a gulp task called gulp test. And what that does is that goes through the entire building and bundling process to build up the bundle, and then it runs your tests against the bundle that you create, which is great, but I'm going to block out those comments. So it's slow. It's a slow process to get your tests going. And on a default SharePoint install on a relatively new laptop, fast machine, on an out-of-the-box experience here, out-of-the-box project, it can take up to 10 seconds just to get your first test to start running. So that was a little too, that wasn't really a great experience for me. So I was trying to find something that was a little bit faster. And there's another tool out there, another testing tool out there called Jest, which is by the Facebook team. It was originally done for those of us who are working with Webpack, but it works, or sorry, not Webpack, with React, but it works just as good with non-React projects as well. So what I would recommend that you try and that you consider is to get rid of Mocha and Chai for your testing solution and your JavaScript projects, and instead decouple them and use Jest, and then also decouple your test from the SharePoint Framework build process. Now, in order to get this to work, it does require a little bit of setup work. So let me kind of walk through a little bit of what this is. And don't worry, I'm going to give you the bad story and then the better story. So the way you're going to do this, the way you set up your projects for working with Jest is you get a multi-step process. So you don't have to do the very first one, but to keep it clean, you're going to want to remove Mocha and Chai, specifically the TypeScript type declarations from your project. You can see that in the first line, a little code snippet you see down there at the bottom. Then you're going to install the Jest tool, which is just a little runtime utility. That includes not only the test runner and the harness, but it also includes everything else that you used to get with both Mocha and Chai. So again, Mocha was a test runner and a test library. We get that as 2-in-1 in Jest. And then Chai was an assertion library. So when you run your tests, for a test to fail, you would have to generally throw an exception or throw an error. And what an assertion library does, it allows you to say things like, I expect this variable to equal 1. And if it doesn't, then write this error message out. And then it just makes it a little bit cleaner to write your tests. Jest has an assertion library in it already. So you don't need two things. You just need the one for everything. Because we're using TypeScript and Jest is by default, is expecting JavaScript, you have to add in a preprocessor that tells Jest to compile all the TypeScript down to JavaScript first. And then you're also going to want to install some type declarations to making working with the assertion libraries a little bit easier. Now, the last thing you end up having to do is you're going to end up creating some sort of a Jest configuration. And what this does is it tells, you can do all this on the command line every time you run it, but that's a pain. So you can create a configuration object that lives either in the package.json file or is going to live in a separate config file. And what that does is it just sets all the default settings that you would need inside of Jest when you run it. So telling it to use the preprocessor and where should it look for test files and where should it look for code files, etc. The last thing you do that I would recommend you do at least is to update your test script that you have in the package.json file so that you can just run npm test and it will do all the stuff that it needs to run Jest and to plug in the configuration file and make your life a heck of a lot easier, as you can see there from the code at the bottom. That's a lot of stuff to do, though. Now, that's one thing that I wanted to look at, but the next thing is, what if you're going to be using React? So when you want to test your React components, you generally want to test the rendering of these. And when I say rendering, I don't mean like the way it shows up on the screen. I mean, let's see the resulting markup that comes out that would be rendered by the browser. I don't care how it's rendered. I just want to make sure that the markup is correct because, well, that's really the only thing that I can really test for in a really easy and fast way. Jest by default includes something called the React test renderer. What that is it just allows you to give it a React component and it can render out the component and spit out the HTML and do the test for it. It has a concept called shallow rendering. So if you have nested components, it's only going to render out the one that you're telling it you want it to render. So other nested components inside of it won't be rendered out as well. So you don't get a whole tree. You just test the one that you're looking at. Has a concept of snapshots, which is basically going to say, here's what the HTML should look like. And if it's not, then throw an error. Now, this renderer is nice, but it's pretty simple. It's pretty limited. And what some other people ended up doing was, I'll touch on in a second, is they built a better renderer that we all end up using. So if you're testing React with Jest, how do you do this? Well, you're going to have to install the test renderer first. You're probably, because we're using TypeScript in the SharePoint framework, you're going to want to install the type declaration as well. And then there's this other thing called the identity object proxy. And what that is, and you can kind of see that in the code snippet down there at the bottom in my config file. Effectively, what this is saying is that, hey, when the test engine, when you run across a reference that's trying to ingest a CSS or a SAS file, just ignore it. So the identity object proxy is just saying, don't do anything with this. Just treat it as an inert thing. Just kind of bypass it. Otherwise, you get these weird things that show up. All right, so that's just some of the other configuration you do when you're doing your testing here. Apparently, it's turned into a weather update in the chat. So then you say, well, I want to go on to the next level here. I want to do something a little bit more with the rendering. And there's a company called Airbnb. Everybody's probably heard of it. What they did is they created a better rendering engine than what we get out of the box in React. And this engine is called Enzyme. And what's so cool about this is that it's designed to kind of sit on top of the out-of-the-box renderer, but it gives us a lot of really cool capabilities and makes things a lot easier. For example, it's very easy to get access to a component that's been rendered and then simulate the clicking of a button and reacting to those different events. In order to use it, though, you've got to have this other thing installed. And you guys may be looking at this and rolling your eyes going, geez, he's telling me all this stuff that I have to do to get this to work. I mean, trust me, things are going to get better in just a minute. So how do you set up Enzyme? You know, oh, my God, look at all this stuff at the bottom. I've got to install Enzyme, and I have to install the Enzyme engine first. And then I have to install an adapter because the engine works with all versions of React, but I might need one for React 15 or I may need one for React 16. And that's where we have adapters to do that. And then, oh yeah, I'm in TypeScript, so I need type declarations. And I need this thing called Enzyme to JSON to make snapshots a little bit easier. And then I'm going to need this thing called a polyfill called the Request Animation Frames Polyfill, RAF, to simulate the fact that there's a special API in a browser that's not in the headless browsers that Jest is using. And then I got to go through and set up all of this stuff with Enzyme. And I do that by initializing Enzyme and then initializing the adapter and then wiring those two together and then go into the configuration file and say, hey, Jest, when you run, go run that setup file that sets up Enzyme. It's a lot of stuff to do. And then let's throw a little bit more complexity onto it. There are two different versions of React that a lot of our SharePoint framework projects are using today. It wasn't until just recently that the SharePoint framework version 1.7 came out that revs support for React 16. Prior to that, we were on React 15. Well, there's a bit of a challenge here because when you look at the tools that we use for React 16, some of those tools are expecting us to use the latest version of TypeScript, which we're not doing today in the SharePoint framework. There was a thing in the chat just a few minutes ago where we may see that change in 1.8. But for example, the TypeScript preprocessor expects you to be using TypeScript version 3. And we're still on 2.4.2. So you've got all these special versions you got to keep track of and everything, and it's a royal pain. But things are easier. All right, so this is where the good story kicks in. So what I've done is I went ahead and I created these things called presets. And what it does is it says, instead of all that stuff that I just went through with you, you're going to be able to very easily just say, I want to use Jest on my project. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to first install Jest, and then I'm going to install the appropriate preset in my project based on what I'm doing. Maybe I'm no React. Maybe I'm React 15. Maybe I'm React 16. Then, after you do that, you're going to want to start testing for fun, productivity, and profit. And why do I say profit? Because these warrior horses, as Chris has showed us in the past, these things get expensive. And so you need the profit to be able to pay for all the food that these things are going to use. If you want to learn more about it, I've got a blog post that explains it, but here's the easy part. I'm going to do a demo in just a second. If you're not using React, it's very simple. You just go say npm install, or in my case, I'm using yarn add. You tell it you want to install Jest, and then the preset you want. And then the -d at the end says, I only care about this stuff in a developer environment, so only install it as a dev dependency. And then the same thing is true with React 15 and React 16. So let's take a look at this. So if I jump over here to my machine, what I've got is just a standard SharePoint framework project that is using React. So you can see here I'm using React 16. Now, notice a little bit farther down that in the dev dependencies, I don't have any mention of Jest anywhere. And in addition, over here in my test, you see I'm using gulp test. So this is just a standard out-of-the-box SharePoint framework web part done as React. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this thing up for working with Jest and our Jest preset that I talked about just a few minutes ago. So I'm going to do that by saying yarn add or npm install Jest, and then I'm going to install the preset called Jest preset SPFx React 16-D. I'm going to cross the fingers, and the demo worked just fine this morning before the session, so we'll double check it looks good now. Everything should have been cached, so this should go nice and quick. When it sits on 0 of 2100, that's always fun. There we go. And better when the 2100 turns into 4900 and then 3300. Ta-da, we're done. All right, so what did that just do to our project? It did a couple things. So first of all, I scroll down, you'll see that I have Jest installed and I have this preset installed. And what did that do? So under the covers here, what that did is it added in this preset that you'll find right here. Oops, scroll to this. Added in this preset, and this package.json installed all the necessary dependencies and stuff that we needed in order for this thing to work. All right, so it has all the right version numbers and all the stuff that we need for this to work. It also has the configuration here for using Enzyme. It's already got that set up, and it's created its own configuration file for all the stuff that you need in order to do use Jest and Enzyme and all that in your machine. So it makes your life a heck of a lot easier here. It even has, where'd my mouse go? Come back. Where is my mouse? Come back. There we go. Let's see. So we did that, and has everything else all set up that you're going to need with this. I've even gone through, and in these examples here, I've even set up a couple examples here. So if we copy these guys, let's copy, and let's come over to my project. And if I go into source, and let's just drop them into the root here, paste. There we go. So you can see here I've got my sample. Here's a sample component right here. Here is a test associated with it as well. You can either use the out-of-the-box renderer or the Enzyme renderer, explaining how that works. But then how are you actually leveraging this in your project? Well, the other thing that when you installed this, what it did is it created inside the config folder, what it did is it added in this Jest config. and it says, what preset am I using? And so it's basically saying, go use the configuration that package you just installed, go use that configuration that's already been set up for you. And it just tells us where the root directory is. So, ta-da, we're all good. So, and, oh yeah, the last thing it did, it even went in and it set up your special test. It actually did two of them. It did a test and a test watch. So that now if I just run npm test, it should do everything with Jest. So let's give that a shot. Clear it out. I say npm test. You cross your fingers, and hopefully the live demo gods are going to be nice to you. And I did it inside of a VM, so things were a little bit slower, but you can see everything ran within 8 seconds with these tests of not only testing a testable service, but also testing an actual component with the rendering. And you can see here it even generated a snapshot. So the next time I run it, should go a little bit faster, but it's going to match that snapshot. 3, 4, 5, 6. Come on, go before 8. There we go, 2 seconds faster. We can see that the snapshot was valid. So if I go back and look at the code here and open this up and look in the source, and my project's a little messy now because I just threw those files into wherever we had it. Here's the snapshot using the Enzyme to JSON, or not Enzyme, yeah, Enzyme to JSON snapshot as well. So this makes your life a hell of a lot easier. If you want to use these, again, you just check out the blog post that I mentioned a second ago here in the slide. Excuse me, warrior horses, we have something to do here. Move. Well, we'll just do it like that. There you go. David Warner just posted in the chat. So you can take a look at that if you want to learn more about how this stuff works and what, you know, understanding how the pieces are set together. The one thing that I will tell you when you use this, let me open up a browser real quick here. Chrome. Nope, we're not trying Safari. Apple's as bad as Microsoft is and getting them to use your browsers. AndrewConnell.com. Let me find that package really quick. I want to show you one thing, and then I will wrap up because I see how much time we have. Where is it? Right. Enable Gene Jest. And let's find. Scroll bar is going too fast. Let's go to this guy. All right. So let's say, where's the GitHub? So go to the project. So you're going to run into, you may run into something with your project here. And if you look at the issues, you'll see this. You'll see the same command where people keep mentioning the same thing of a challenge here, where they talk about they're getting like something where things are not running because of you're not importing stuff correctly. And the reason for this is under the covers, Jest is ignoring all of the stuff. It's not processing any of the stuff or transpiling anything from the node modules folder. All of the packages, or a lot of the packages that are done for the SharePoint framework and are done in other related packages are all done using ES6, or all the transpiled down to ES6 and shipped that way. Jest by default is not expecting that. It's expecting them to be as ES5. And so you'll start to see these errors that pop up with things like, I don't understand what the word import is, because that's not an ES5 term, it's an ES6 term. When you see these kinds of things, take a second and think about what are you trying to do? Because what I see most of the time is that you're really going to want to mock these up, or you want to ignore these things. And if you look in the issues here, I actually give you a couple examples of how you get around it, trying to find a cleaner solution to it. But effectively what you're going to do is, like if you're doing your testing, you shouldn't be running a unit test that checks to see what the current value of my SharePoint environment is. Am I in localhost or I'm in a live environment? You're testing. That doesn't matter, right? That doesn't matter, and it's irrelevant, in fact, because you're not in either one of those environments. You really want to mock that up and have a hard-coded value get returned back to you. So that's where we're seeing most of the challenges of people coming into when they're working with Jest or with other testing tools as well. And just think about, you always want to follow the rule when you're testing of just testing the system under test, your code. You don't want to test Microsoft's code. You don't want to test some other web service or anything. That's not stuff that you can impact. And even if it was, you don't need to be filing a bug in your project for a broken widget that's coming from somebody else's, UI components. In this case here, I'm not referring to the patterns and practices project. You want to keep them separate. So that's everything that I want to cover with this. I hope this was useful to you. Those libraries or those packages are out there for anybody to use if you want to use them. They are also part of the patterns and practices generator that Stefan Bauer has done. So if you want to end up using React in there, we are using those pieces as well. So it makes your life a hell of a lot easier. Now you don't have to remember all these different versions you have to do. Basically, leave that up to me. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Patrick and Vesa.